All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Murray. I'm the president of the National Museum of Language, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's presentation um, on a very intriguing subject. I'm just going to be speaking for a few minutes about some background on the National Museum of Language for those of you who are new to us, and it'll be a bit of review for those who are longtime members. So, well, first of all, I wanted to read you the mission statement of the National Museum of Language in case you hadn't seen it before. We actually worked on this for about a year to come up with the wording we wanted to have as our mission statement. So here it is. The National Museum of Language honors and supports language acquisition, utilization, and preservation, along with linguistic and cultural diversity. Through our outreach activities and online resources, we celebrate the magic and beauty of human communication. Uh, so the National Museum of Language was launched in 1997 after several decades of thinking about it and trying to decide what it should be by our founder, Dr. Amelia Murdoch, and was established as a 501(c)(3) organization in 1998. The National Museum of Language is actually one of the only museums in the world devoted to a wide range of language issues. And I bring this up because we're a participant in something called the International Network of Language Museums. And so I've met online people from many language museums around the world, but most of them focus on the language of the country in which they're located. Whereas we have a more universal approach to looking at languages. So that's one of the things that's different about us. The themes of the museum are universal aspects of language, the use of language in society, and languages of the world. Because we do have programs that we talk about specific languages, and on our newsletter and website, we often have articles about unique languages that are spoken in a few places. Um, so as far as where we are, people always ask, well, where is the museum? And the museum is actually a completely online museum. We don't have a building. Um, we did have a rented physical space from 2008 to 2013 where we could host exhibits and speaker programs and outreach activities. But due to a number of factors, including the cost of maintaining a physical facility, which was really quite excessive, um, we transitioned to a hybrid virtual museum in 2013. And we say hybrid, we did continue to have some in-person activities in community spaces, such as speaker programs and offering language activities in county summer camps and sharing activities with community organizations while developing virtual exhibits that were shared on the museum's website. With that experience, when the COVID pandemic hit, we were actually well positioned to transition smoothly to an all virtual format. And we offered all our speaker programs online, and we developed new online exhibits. And while this may have seemed like a blow, it actually uh, we made a virtue out of necessity. And going all online, we've expanded our reach of the museum throughout not just the United States, but around the world. And we had, some of our programs would have hundreds of people tuning into them. And we have something like 100,000 people who visit our website, people from many countries around the world. So going online has probably been a good thing for us. Another thing we did was that in 2021, we launched our liaison program. So we recruited liaisons primarily from throughout the United States, state liaisons, as well as liaisons in several national language related organizations and in a number of foreign countries. And the purpose of the liaison program was to expand awareness of the museum, and we invited the liaisons to share information with us that we could post on our website about activities going on in their states or in their communities that were language related. So that's been a good thing. As far as how are we supported, we're a completely independent museum. We don't have a big foundation. In fact, we don't have a foundation at all that supports us. We rely on individual donations from people who are supporters or friends of the museum. We also apply for grants at the federal, state, and local level. If you've been following the news lately, you may have noticed that there's been massive cutbacks in support to humanities-focused organizations, whether it's museums, educational organizations, and so on. So we are impacted by that as well. We have, for the last few years, we were getting some pretty nice grants from federal and state resources. That's just about dried up at the moment. So fundraising is a big issue, but we're doing the best we can. We still are continuing to support unique and engaging speaker programs, as we will have today, on approximately a quarterly basis. But in the past year, we've actually upped the speaker programs to probably at least once a month, or sometimes even twice in 1 month. This is mostly due to Greg Nedved, our former president, who's here with us today. He's been very energetic in recruiting speaker events for us, and we're grateful for that. Just to give you an idea, we talk about exhibits. I think, how can you have a digital museum and have exhibits if you don't have a building? But if you go to our website, you will see that we have quite a few exhibits. Some of our major exhibits have included one on we call the 1812 exhibit, which details the evolution of American English following the War of 1812. Another one that has an American focus is on the development of the Dictionary of American Regional English, or DARE, a big project at the University of Wisconsin at Madison that's been going on for about 60 years. And we have an exhibit called Philagelos, the oldest joke book. This was a joke book first written in ancient Greece around 400 AD. And we have a artist in residence who's not with us for this meeting, but she's taken a lot of these jokes and sort of put them into cartoon format. And we have it, you can hear the ancient Greek even being spoken, as well as English translation of the jokes. And that's actually one of our most popular exhibits. It's withstanding the test of time. I think people are curious about it. So it's something we can get to on our website. We also have something called Sharing Our Stories, a collection of children's stories in 17 languages with English translations. Another one of our big exhibits is called The Power of Poetry, Resisting Injustice with Language, featuring poems with social justice themes from 14 countries from ancient times to the present day in their original languages and with English translation. So that's an idea of what we have that's on our website in terms of exhibits. I don't want to take any more time away from our speaker today, so unless anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer a question, or you can put a question in the chat. But I'm going to turn the floor back over to Emily to continue with the program.
Great. And I think next we have Greg Nedved with us, our former NML president, who will introduce our speaker. And then after Greg's introduction, I'll just offer a few procedural notes on the program, and then we'll turn it over to the speaker for the program.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Emily. I'm Greg Nedved. I trust you can all hear me okay. I have a pretty loud voice, or at least I can have a loud voice. And one of the things I like to do when I look for speakers is to find topics that are not all that well known. And I think here we have definitely been successful. Today we're going to hear about languaging and linguistic liberation, which is something I knew nothing about until about 3-4 months ago. So I think we're all going to learn a lot today. Our speaker is Maria Rosa Breas Vaughn, who's a clinical professor in the Department of Communicative Sciences and Disorders at NYU, that's New York University in New York City. In addition to having a doctorate, she has a certificate in clinical competence in speech language pathology. Her focus as an instructor has been multilingualism and disability. And the things that she likes to do in a classroom and in the community, and she's going to talk about these, I'm sure, is a focus on researching the impact of standardized linguistic ideologies in speech language practices, sustaining variability in languaging in the classroom, and finally, co-envisioning a path for linguistic liberation through art. Recently, Maria Rosa and her students put together a pop-up exhibition, or a pop-up exhibit, I should say, about languaging at NYU, which I'm sure she'll talk about as well. Okay, so I don't want to take any more time away from the speaker. I'll turn it back to Emily for an administrative announcement or two. Thank you for being here, Maria Rose, and we're all looking forward to this.
Great. Thank you, Greg. So again, thanks everyone for joining us today. Just a couple notes on the program. So we're going to get started with Maria Rosa in just a couple minutes. As she's speaking, if you do have any questions, please go ahead and drop those into the chat. She will be taking your questions both at about a halfway point through the program. We'll be taking a break probably a little bit before 3:00 p.m. Eastern time, just a 5-minute break to let everyone stretch their legs. And then also at the very end of the program, so any questions or comments, please do drop them in the chat and we will get to them at that time. You are welcome to be on or off camera. If you're a guest here, we'd love to see you. If you want to be off camera, that's fine too. We do ask that you mute yourself if you're not speaking, though, just to avoid any noise interference, since we are also recording the program. And finally, if you have any technical difficulties, feel free to message me in the chat and I will see if I can help you out. And with that, I will turn it over to Maria Rosa to get us started.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Yes, I just see some faces popping up so I can see that I am being heard. Let me go ahead and share my screen, including sound, and then make sure that we are in presentation mode. All right. Hopefully everybody can see. Yes. Excellent. So today, as you heard from Greg and Laura, and as well as Emily, we are talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is questioning ideas of quote unquote good. And then we see the word languaging, ing there, in higher education. We'll get to this in a moment. I try to make sure that every photograph that I include has a caption to it. And there's a little notation later on that you'll see that every photograph in this presentation is actually mine. So I took them. So some disclosures that I'm a salaried full-time faculty at New York University on my 8th year at the university starting this September, and that most of the work that is going to be sort of the conceptual basis that is already pre-published either by other authors or by myself and or is in the process of being written or co-written with my co-authors. Just making sure that I'm not losing any of the chats or missing any of the chats. Oh. And thank you to the National Museum of Language for inviting me into this collective. So the way that I'm going to go through this, and actually the person who inspired the conception that I'm going to share with you all is actually here, who was my former student, but has been a colleague from the start, Gianna Chafe. And Gianna always says at the beginning of her explanations, come on a journey with me. So come on a journey with me. I'm first going to give you a little bit of context that comes from specifically my field, which is the field or the discipline of speech language pathology. including who I am in that field and sort of what my journeys have been to some extent. And then we'll really shift focus rather quickly to this conception or this idea or topic of ideologies or ideologies of good languaging. And I'll give you some examples from my classroom teaching, as well as from what I call my classroom without walls spaces. And so to start with, I'm a lover of trees, nature in general, and finding this specimen that you see here with this connection with the heart at the center, it made me think a lot about the field and the idea of what is a linguistic difference versus what is a linguistic disability, and that dichotomy that the field itself or the speech language pathology discipline has developed for all of us who are practitioners, researchers, even sometimes if we become people who receive the services, are positioned into as little boxes, right? So the question at the top is, are these two really a dichotomy, or are they just two trunks of the same tree? And to give you a little bit of context, sort of zooming out, this is right out of the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association website. And particularly if you go to the top sentence that states that the traditional role of the speech language pathologist has been to provide clinical services for the communicatively, I'm going to use disabled, not handicapped, because that's not the word that we use anymore. And then, you know, sort of this explanation that it is possible that you're going to have people who speak quote unquote differently, right? Or speak languages that are different when you have individuals that you have to provide the services for. So the idea here being that is crucial, because as a discipline, we ascribe to, or we position ourselves in what would be more aligned with what a medical model of disability would do. And I'll explain in a moment what that means, that we need to make sure that we know who fits as having a disability or living with a disability and who doesn't, because we don't want to be providing services to people who do not need the services, right? And so when you go to the doctor provides a series of tests. They're going to tell you your symptoms match for X, Y, or Z, or it doesn't match, right? Like a couple of weeks ago, I had an upper respiratory infection. I went in to get tested for COVID. And fortunately, I did not have COVID, but I had a pretty bad upper respiratory infection. So that didn't save me from being in the little box of sick. But as you see in the last sentence, once the difference / disability, or in this case, my field uses disorders, distinctions have been made, it is the role of the speech language pathologist to treat only those features or characteristics that are true errors and not attributed to maybe another language, or in this case, they're mentioning dialect. So again, it's not saying that if a disability is present that in a person who maybe speaks multiple languages, it's not saying that a person who speaks or communicates in multiple languages would not also live with a disability that is a communicative disability in this case, but it is sort of saying we have a need to be careful and mindful and intentional in determining what are those aspects that actually belong to a disability versus a way of speaking that may be different from whatever language is centered. Okay. And so again, there is this, and this is part again of the website, and the website serves as a space for clinicians to go back to, but also for families, like public, to go and get educated on these concepts that are specific to the discipline of speech language therapy. And so under here, we see that it requires that we be considerably careful, because individuals who come to us for services may also be experiencing, and then I list a number of other potential negative outcomes, but maybe also just regular outcomes due to development. So language development, quote unquote, language loss, the impact of language dominance fluctuation, and the influence of language acquisition that happens in more than one tongue, right? Or linguistic code. And so all of those have to be in the realm of our awareness and also part of our evidence basis when we go to diagnose. And so already you have a context of how this field operates and the fact that we borrow a lot from linguistics, we borrow considerably from psychology and other established sciences, we borrow a lot from anything that is considered hard science, right? And so at the center of this whole thing, though, the question is who speaks a language in a different way? And who speaks a language in a disabled way? We could say in a divergent way too. And again, when we put something at the center, then what is at the center? Okay, and that's what we're going to be sort of interrogating as we go along. And so the question here is, you know, if we zoom into any kind of issue, we are attending to the details of the issue that we are able to focus our attention on. So you see here to the left, there are two views of the same tree. One, having only one view doesn't give you the full perspective. And so the questions that then emerge for me, grounded in this idea that Irvin and Gall, you know, published many years ago, is there, you know, the notion that there is no view from nowhere, the fact that every perspective that we bring into anything that we do is going to be positioned on a series of beliefs potentially, right? And so questions that arose for me as I began this journey now a number of years ago is who is centered? Who is at the center when we say who is this, you know, who is speaking in a different way or who is communicating in a different way and who is using language in a disabled way? Who is at the center? What is left out whenever we define a someone at the center? And then what is at the really at the root of the dichotomy? Because that's really interesting. And it's something that my field has not addressed at all yet. And so I thought that it would be interesting to present these, you know, bringing in some of what my daughter has taught me as a Gen Zer, some of the TikToks that are out there, and see what we come up with ourselves by listening to some of these individuals. So the first, again, remember, we're looking at who is centered, okay? And potentially what is left out, and also what eventually we get to what is at the root, which is probably the next slide. Okay, so who is centered?
Reflection time. Why is it that we get so excited when we see a white English-speaking child adding Spanish to their linguistic repertoire? Oh my God, habla español! But we don't get excited when a Spanish-speaking student enters the schooling system feeling more comfortable in Spanish and adding English to their linguistic repertoire. In fact, we quote them at risk. And why is it that when we see an adult who identifies as white speaking Spanish, we get equally thrilled because, you know, their parents were able to send them to study abroad for a year in Spain or to do missionary work for 3 summers in Latin America. But yet, Maria, Jose, and Lucia have been bilingual in English and Spanish their entire lives, you know, because they breathed and lived in their community. But we don't get excited about that. Remember that language constructs race, and race is used to promote the linguistic ideologies of the dominant culture, not the linguistically minoritized communities. And so that's a system of oppression. And so if we are following that system, does that mean that we are oppressors?
And that's Dr. Jose Medina. If you don't follow him, he is hilarious. He does very much show up in his truth. So be ready for that. The second one is a little soft, but I think that the captioning will capture her good enough.
Listen, primos, you know, I only come on here to address comments when I got time and say I got time. This notion that Dominicans can't speak proper Spanish is very much giving anti-Black. And let me tell you why. Proper, professional is oftentimes adjacent to white. We glorify British English, but we put down Jamaican English. We put down AAVE and Ebonics. Similarly, in Latin America, we put down a lot of coastal Caribbean Spanish dialects. Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, etc., even some parts of Colombia that are closer to the coast, speak with a different dialect, right? Notice I'm code switching everything to its entirety right now so you can understand exactly what I'm saying. But if I want to switch it up and talk different, y'all gonna still understand me if you come from a shared culture, if you've been exposed enough. So all that to say, challenge the way you think about what's considered proper, because usually it's adjacent to whiteness.
And so the first two basically allude to this notion of whiteness as an ideology, not whiteness necessarily as the skin color, but also language being the carrier, the site of a hierarchy, right? And that's already kind of giving an idea of where we're going with the notion of ideologies in terms of language and languaging. We haven't quite gotten to languaging yet, but just that notion of that. The last one is important because it actually is very much centered in my field. So I think that if I click on here, just bear with me because it is on my Instagram. It doesn't have sound. That's an important one too, because a lot of the times what we consider silence is something in the field of speech language pathology becomes pathologized. We don't want silence. We want what I'm doing here. We want this is positioned as higher in the hierarchy. And so again, the who is center. You decide what goes in the center of that circle tree roots where my daughter was at the center, right? But you already may be getting some of these ideas from these these videos here. So what is left out then is the notion that language lives in our bodies, that I'm using my hands to speak, but I could also be using my face to show you when I'm angry, when I'm not angry. My eyes pop really big when I'm interested, right? My brother was always making fun of me when I was little as a result of that. And also that it is situated, localized within our communities. In my field, and again, I'm coming at you from this field of speech language pathology. However, these definitions are also very prevalent in special education and in a number of other fields that also intersect with individuals, with humans, that define how humans are going to be able to partake or how functional they're going to be to a society. But in my field, the focus is language structure and universality, content, form, and use. There's nothing wrong with that. We can absolutely, we need it to be able to learn it. Okay, we learn a little bit later why and when the adherence to just one definition, the putting one thing at the center and everything else being on the periphery, and then the periphery being considered less quote unquote good, being what we maybe need to contend with. Okay, my field primarily centers quantitative research methods, so there's a lot of generalizations that are made as a result. Qualitative and mixed methods are emerging now in terms of the literature and scholarship, but it's a lot harder to publish those articles than it is to publish traditional, what we call traditional science. The role of power and politics is non-existent in the literature, and it's non-existent in our training programs, meaning that majority of the ways in which knowledge is built is coming from scientists and or speech language therapists who are on the therapy side, and there's a power dynamic there too, expressing their notions of what good language or what competent language and what good ability in communicating are. Obviously, that these don't happen in a vacuum either, right? We know that they are socialize. We get into that in a little moment. And then hegemony is prioritized. So the notions that El Professor Medina talked a little bit in the previous video about racialization through language and what the second speaker was talking about, which is enregisterment, right, are not named at all. this notion that sometimes there are some forms or varieties that are considered to be performing a certain level that is more elevated, that is not named in my field. And then the third one is the notion that variability can be dynamic, that it can change. So there's a centering of monolingualism or the monoglot aspiration as the horizon. And so what that prompted for me was a questioning of what is at the root. And what is interesting with this is that at the root, then it dropped me to read about ideologies or belief systems. In my discipline, in the field of speech language pathology, the closest that we get to interrogating or getting in touch with our belief systems is by asking how comfortable are we to engage in providing services to quote unquote individuals, sorry, not yet, to individuals who quote unquote are culturally and linguistically diverse. And that is in quotation marks. So again, this notion of difference being the other, right, is one space. And I should say, which is something I didn't say at the beginning, that the field's demographics are telling of why these ideas are present, although I don't like to just go to the notion of identity as being the performative factor, because it's, again, we're noticing that there's something that is deeper than even the way we present ourselves, and that without the criticality for who we are and what our ideas are and what our belief systems have been, it doesn't matter who we are or what we are positioned like within society. But this notion of cultural linguistic diversity as the other is present. I mean, as late as a couple of weeks ago or last week, there was a paper that came out asking precisely that same question to practitioners. And it was a big, large data survey that took place by 4 speech language pathology researchers that was countrywide during 2020, 2021. And individuals basically said monolingual speech language pathologists, who are 92% of the field, feel unprepared for providing services. Bilingual speech language pathologists also feel underprepared, but they're a little bit better prepared than monolingual speech language pathologists to provide bilingual services. So again, this notion of ideas, that's the farthest we go. That is as deep as we basically are like snorkeling when it comes to this notion of ideas or ideology specifically. And so it made me curious to kind of follow to really like get my hands dirty into like, what can I dig at to see what is the way in which these notions are described in literature that we are not exposed to as a discipline. And so at the root of it all is the notion of standardization. And speech language pathology is a field that, again, I mentioned this to begin with, adheres to the medicalized model of disability, adheres to the medicalized model of human beings, in sense of we're going to find anything that doesn't fit within that bell curve, right? And whatever's at the end of that bell curve, specifically at the lower end, we're going to consider it not typical. But it also, within that bell curve, this notion of the bell curve is also like typicality with regard to centering English as the language that is the most common language. And again, I could get into the historical reasoning for this. This goes back to the foundation of the profession. There are a couple of papers that have finally come out that look at the field's history from a critical perspective. But all to say that we've never questioned what is our definition of language and what is at the root of that definition. And so at the root of the definition, then I identify that there's some ideas or beliefs about competence, that there's some ideas or beliefs about languagelessness, just as you noticed in the video that had the deaf communicator. And there's some ideas about the notion of how race and language are co-constructed. And here, the notion of competence also relates to ability, right? And so we cannot only look at language by itself. We have to also consider that language becomes the way by which we perform, whether we are capable of something or not, or are perceived as smart or not. And so that became very interesting to me. And so here's where I then tell you then, how do I come to engage with the work, right? And I think, there's a couple of pieces. Language is important to me in a number of ways. I'm fascinated by it, but I'm also very intentional about the words that I choose to use. So starting at the bottom, you see the suffix IZED. You might have heard Professor Medina, who talked about minoritized, linguistically minoritized. I use that suffix to suggest that the ITY or ITIES that sometimes we are added as minorities is actually an erasure of the way in which power shows up in societies. We are minoritized, we can be marginalized. Also, we are part of the global majority if you look at us in other ways. So I'm very intentional about using that IZED word when it comes to talking about linguistic minoritized people. And I don't like to use language diversity to label a group of people. I don't believe in diversity in a group of people unless it's a group of people that actually has a bunch of people who are very different from one another, not just the people who are Black and brown, right? Or who speak in a way that would denote that they're Black and brown. And the other piece about it is this notion of languaging, which I'll get into next. But my purpose with this presentation, but also my life's work over the last 5 to 6 years, and with the help of my co-learners, some of whom are in the room, has been to expand how we define language within ourselves, which is part of our own liberatory idea. So like what Greg initially mentioned to the crowd of like, what is linguistic liberation? It lies within this acknowledgement that language is more than the pieces that I gave you at the beginning. So we get more into this. And again, I cannot take that away from other parts of my positionalities. I was born and raised in the Dominican Republic. I came to the United States as an immigrant at the age of 17. I have since then become a citizen of the US and also have achieved with my family's support the space of being a scholar, the space of being a professional, and also the space of also training the next generation of professionals that are there. So all of this kind of comes into what I do in my classrooms and also how I think and what I believe in. And so arrives 2022, 2021, 2022, and I meet my colleague Clara Vaz Fowler on what used to be Twitter at the time before it was taken over. And we engage in a series of conversations, and those conversations lead us to go to like WhatsApp or to even Zoom on Fridays to talk about what our knowledge of language was. Clara is a sociolinguist. She's Brazilian, and I come from speech and language pathology. So Clara's work is usually with English as a new language, which is how it's called, or training teachers who will be teaching world languages or foreign languages, as well as children who come to this country as immigrants like me. And so we begin this conversation in sort of unearthing of belief systems. And then we decided, why don't we write this up as a tutorial for my field? And that's how this paper in 2023 comes to be created as a fruit of our conversations. And so the notion of dialogue is very much prevalent or present in this paper, but I also decided to go very multimodal with the notion of, with the idea of making sure that something that is very abstract, like the notion of beliefs, which is something that we don't see, that lies under the earth, right? That it could be made a little bit more concrete. And so I came up with this illustration at the time. If we consider the waters that we swim in and that we maybe travel in as the sociopolitical contexts in which we exist, then we know that in those waters are going to be all kinds of specimens and lived organisms, including a series of particles, maybe sediments that we're going to call beliefs, okay? And those beliefs are always there. They're there because they're acceptable to societies. They're there because they're ingrained eventually into institutions, but they're not inherently bad or good. And so when I use the word good, even at the beginning of this talk, I don't want us to like lose track of the fact that that's still a binary, right? That what is there is the notion of when does it become quote unquote good or not good, right? That's what we need to be asking. And so those belief systems over time, as they become acceptable in societies, and I have another illustration that I did for a more recent paper from 2025 that's a little bit different than this one, but it kind of gets at the same idea, can become what are called dogmas. They become dogmatic. They become the ways by which we determine what is right and what is wrong, whether we belong or do not belong, or fit in or do not fit in with what the societal expectation may be for whatever it is that that belief system is addressing, in this case, language. So what is considered good language, as we maybe got gathered from before, is maybe a language that is quote unquote has the myth of the non-accent, has the myth of being standardized, has the myth of not being divergent in terms of how it is produced, meaning there's not a lot of silences. It is easy to be understood. But again, all of that is subjective, right? And we know that it is subjective. And linguists have also looked at this notion of accents and standardization as also being man-made subjective, or people-made, human-made subjective ideas. But as these beliefs become cohesive over time, these dogmas become hegemonies, and then they begin to determine who in society is positioned as having more access to certain opportunities and who doesn't. And when I say society, I also mean institutions. And so then what happens is that over time, we can anchor ourselves on these ideologies or ideologies. We may travel within a field, and the person that is in the sorry, not in the field, in the boat, right? Consider the boat being any institution, including organizations, but also like materials that represents the institutions, the practices that we do. The human who's in there is still semi-autonomous, meaning that that human can choose to have the same beliefs, but eventually they can also choose not to have the same beliefs. The same can be said to some extent by institutions, depending upon who rules guides them. So this is the idea that kind of brought then me and Clara and I to define what are the hegemonies that kind of guide speech language pathology. And we came up with 3 major definitions. And those were language as an object, which we kind of alluded to before, the notion of structure, the notion of content, form, and use. But also within that notion of content, form, and use, there's a specific way in which that content, form, and use have to be analyzed, have to be tracked. So you think about the notion of milestones. You take your child to the doctor tells you your child is achieving these milestones as expected. Who was the sample for those milestones? And who is left out of those milestones? Once again, the objects themselves, the milestones, the idea that there are structures are not wrong. They're not bad in and of themselves. They're just beliefs, right? Beliefs that we want to strive towards. We want to teach, we want to be able to learn things, right? But anytime then we use that to determine who the person is who may be doing good or not good, then that's something that we want to interrogate more. The notion that language, as it comes from nation states. In my field, there's a big push on difference, as you've seen. And that is also achieved through, tools like the famous phonetic and phonotactic inventories, the collection of sounds, how people in different countries may say things, except that when we talk about different countries, sometimes we also homogenize an entire country into one language. And then language is idealized. And I'm not saying that these rocks in and of themselves, or hegemonies in and of themselves, kind of like live outside or don't collide with one another, because there can be idealization of a nation state tongue. There can be idealization of an object, a set of objects or structures. Like, for example, the way that we consider a language to be more proper, or the way that we consider a language to be more professional, or the fact that I am here giving a talk, right? We know that that's already being idealized in comparison to maybe how I would talk to my friends, right? And so there is this notion, these are the 3 sort of definitions, and we have boxed them in, but primarily that is where they lie within the field. And so what happens because of these is that then we end up with a static view of languaging, one that in which bilinguals are supposed to keep languages separate, in which code switching is okay, but not if it's interference. And especially if you're having a hard time finding a word, then we're going to label it interference, in which proficiency is measurable, and performing it accurately, performing your language accurately means that you have purity, meaning that you are able to keep that other language not as invited, even though it's part of who you are, right? That belonging and mobility and the heterogeneity of who we are is not as important. That yes, people come from somewhere else if they don't speak English, quote unquote, like a native like. But then we also say here, Maria Rosa, why don't you translate this to us to Spanish? Okay, which Spanish do you want me to use? We homogenize in that sense. And then the idea that then when we talk about even treating individuals who are disabled, and I'm not even getting into here about the notion of disability and how disability then is used as a weapon, not to invite a person to use the multiplicity of languages they might have at their disposal, but rather used as an example of cognitive load. Don't expose the child to multiple languages because you might confuse them. That has been refuted in the literature. Even the current literature that we have in speech language pathology has refuted that for many years. But yet it is still a myth out there. It's still a dogma out there, actually, by practitioners. And so the notion that the purpose of every human being who is in any kind of place is to learn a national language, to assimilate into that way, because we want to, quote unquote, understand one another. And so in my field, any use of more than one language can be considered a risk factor. And if we don't follow, that's a good, if we haven't followed, if we don't know enough about, but there's a group of researchers who have done a lot of research on what they constructed as their idea of learning gaps or language gaps. And usually the people who are positioned within those language gaps, again, the people at the middle of the circle that I showed, the root system at the circle, are people who are minoritized in some way. And then finally, and probably the most outstanding one of them all, because being that speech language pathology is a field in which language is in its name, right? We haven't questioned any of these languages in its name. We often, because of the demographics of the field, so I mentioned, 92% are monolingual English speakers, meaning they do not have exposure nor knowledge of other languages. Doesn't mean that they cannot have it. It's just that they identify as monolingual speakers. And there's a lot of nervousness over treating, quote unquote, the other. And so as a result, you can have the individual who may say, okay, I'm monolingual, but I'm going to be neoliberal and say, go ahead and support the other language, but it is the role of the family and not my role to be in that space. And so all of these essentially point at this notion of why we are lacking competence, quote unquote, within our field for engaging with difference and or quote unquote divergence. And so out of the Clara and my paper, what came up, what centered us, or what we centered our thinking on, was this notion of the critical stance. And the critical stance being the how we would engage with one another, the compass to our dialogues, that something that I have brought into my classrooms too, in the last few years. So can we name the ideas that are there? How do we disrupt them? What do we know about the ideas and belief systems that are, how do we reframe them? What is new knowledge I can gain from the ideas? And then that constant reflection and action, which is, it means that we're always going to be circular in our iterative, in our reflection, evaluation, but also our engagement critically with text. So what does that mean? It means that I'm going to be exercising skepticism. I'm going to be interrogating multiple viewpoints. I'm going to be deconstructing the any kinds of notions of power that may be present that I didn't notice before. Committing to seeking alternative ways of viewing any idea that is presented there. And the more that I have engaged with this work, and this was written and published in 2022 and published in 2023, the more that I realized that this is sort of a framework that works even for us now, engaging with the media, seeking what the truth is, right? And so it's more important than ever to be in this space of grounding on critical stances and critical theories. Here's an example of some of the questions that I brought up before. What are the ideas? Where do they come from in the naming dimension? What evidence or experiences do I have that support the, or challenge the ideas? And for our students in our field and in my classrooms, how important it is to also know that the knowledge and the wisdom that we carry within us is also evidence, right? That is not just, it has to be put aside or put outside. How can we represent viewpoints that are previously marginalized by seeking other ideas? And then what are the ways in which these new ideas, I need to keep practicing and thinking about them and talking about them and discussing them? So the notion of dialogue and debate as really coming into the crux of everything that we do. From that, then we engage in then shaking up this notion of hegemony and ableism, of shaking up this notion of bilingualism as a problem, and including kind of like really looking deeply to see what are the ways in which we uphold ableism and essentialism. Listen, our brains are wired to look for categories. That is how we make sense of the world. So that's always going to be there, but it is also, we can rewire ourselves to be attentive and intentional in what is being erased or what is not being centered. And so ought to say too that the lens is always critical theory. So this is not something that is just being critical for the sake of being critical. And that the container that holds my interactions within the classroom is critical pedagogy. So Paulo Freire, Henry Giroux, you know, being big indirect mentors to my work. So now I'm going to shift a little bit. I'm trying to make sure that I have notion of the time, which is almost time for a break. Can I take a couple of minutes just to go over a couple of little things?
Yeah, absolutely. Please go ahead and continue and just break whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Emily. So one of the main questions then that we would ask ourselves is, what are the ideologies that drive my beliefs and that are hidden and not so hidden sometimes in my materials? And so this is the other picture that I alluded to when I showed you the picture of the boat that I recently used in a paper with a number of my former students and a couple of colleagues, looking at 3 children's books and the notion of ideas of good languaging within those 3 children's books. There's a big push for book banning now, right? Like there's always been a movement for book banning, but it's very prevalent nowadays, the amount of censorship that we're seeing, especially in children's literature. And what's interesting is that, and I kind of like really was scared to put this out because I didn't want it to be used in a negative way to weaponize against these books that have actually been published to show a positive lens of language and languaging. But it was really important for me to kind of select these 3 books, that one of which was written by a DACA recipient, right, a dreamer, about her own life as a DACA recipient. And the notion that she says at the end, I am like any other child now. I mean, I'm going to butcher it here because I'm able to speak English. I'm able to read in English and write in English. I can jump rope and I know my way around the subways, even though I don't remember the mountains in Mexico anymore. So, and that is a really soul crushing sort of like, you know, idea, the notion of language loss, right? But also like this positioning and elevation of English as the way to make you be like any other person. And so it made me curious, like, what are the books that are out there that are centered for like people who might be minoritized, like that individual who wrote that book, which is a beautiful book, and it's her experience, so it's valid. And then what are the messages that are being sent to children? And what are the ways to engage with those sometimes problematic messages so that we don't have to get rid of the books, right? And so this again shows that languages or ways of using language and languaging can can be present in society in different ways, but that there's a filter through which oftentimes has to do with socialization, oftentimes has to do with, again, like our exposure to media, our exposure to institutions, and that's going to then reject some forms of languaging as second tier and find one that is the best way. And that almost becomes then what is positioned as the little sticker model that's going to be going through this assembly line of production. Okay, so we reproduce ideologies if we don't become critical about them. So here I focus on 3 other ideologies, but they're similar to the videos that I showed you at the beginning. Orality, which alludes to the deaf signer who talks about autism in speech language pathology. Standard language myth, which is this notion that there's a standardized way of communicating, and the myth of the non-accent, because I just have such an issue with the whole branch of the field that has served to charge extra money because it's not covered by insurance, has pathologized, has created a new pathology in accentedness. And then you see the person opening the box and then taking in that idea and how it becomes then distorted in their self-image as well. Because how many times have you not heard a person, or maybe how many times have you yourself not scrutinized the ways in which you language as a result of what you have learned is to be good or not good, right? And so how we do this is we often analyze artifacts. We also may bring in current events, and then we also provide opportunities for all students to center their authentic languaging in the classroom. This is one example. This little tool is actually in that article from 2025 that I just mentioned. And this is actually the book that I mentioned. And this was a brainstorming activity that we also had in the classroom. And so the notion of assimilation, which in this case was found to be bigger than just language. And this is from my students' minds. So again, not just to create scholarship for the sake of scholarship, but also to create scholarship that allows us to engage with one another. So the point of that paper is also that you can do this work by yourself. The point of Clara Bowler's paper and mine, but also the point of that 2025 paper. This is not work that you do on your own. This is work that you do within collectives. You got to be able to engage. And it's engage in a way, not necessarily that you're going to change minds, but just to be curious. What are other ways of seeing the world that maybe I have not considered before? I bring that into assignments. So this is a paper, an article that came out this year that was after the executive, coincided with the executive order that was put out on designating English as the official language. And I had 2 bilingual students in my classroom who really wanted to engage in podcasting. I'm not going to play the video because it's a little bit lengthy, but they had a great conversation and also brought in their personal life stories, and how Shruti on the left had a very different expectation with her bilingualism. The positioning of English, the elevation of English within her household was very different than what Brinette had to go through, where her bilingualism and her Spanish languaging and her Spanglish, even like her mixing of languages, was also very valued. So all to say that we ourselves have paths that kind of take us to different places in these originating journeys, if you might say. So I see some questions in the chat, and I thought I maybe would engage with those a little bit before we go back to the presentation. And then I kind of reorient us to the latter part of my work the last 2 years. Your focus has been on English and Spanish. Have you spent much time looking at the experiences of speakers of other languages? That's a great question. I actually have not yet done any work engaging with speakers of any language other than myself and my colleagues. Most of the work that has been published, they're newer articles, as you see. Actually, the 2023 piece was my very first authored paper in a journal article. It took me forever. My dissertation was published, but it was ended up published as a chapter. I think the real work that is needed to kind of like uplift what you're saying is actually engaging with those insiders, right? The people who are the speakers of languages, and documenting where their belief systems are. We're doing some of that in my classroom spaces now with people who speak multiple languages, not just specific, not just English. So, and that those are publications that are currently being envisioned to be put together in the fall,
If I can just clarify a little bit, I get the sense, and I might be wrong here, that this is a very new field.
This field of speech language pathology.
Yeah, and so there's still a lot that needs to be done, and that's why sort of my focus on my question about outside of Spanish. What
Uh,
other research is being done in other areas
There,
by
there are,
both across the
yeah.
country, world?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it is a young field, and you're right that, say, in comparison to like applied linguistics, we're a baby discipline. Um, I there is some work that has been done on Englishes, so that includes the creolized varieties. Some work that has been done with Mandarin Chinese speakers, also Urdu, also. So I mean, for me to like mention, because my discipline is quite large. My area is a little area, right? And specifically this area that I'm focused is even littler. That's a pebble at this point. But as a whole, like you could have people who are interested in perception of speech. You can have people who are interested in production of speech and language. You can have people who are interested in the intersection between identification of disorders in each of those specific languages or in comparison to. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. There are people looking at a variety, but not in terms of this specific area of belief systems. I'm the first
Okay,
one
no,
to
you
talk
answered
about
the
it. So,
question.
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then the other question that you asked was, what is the biggest obstacle that you have encountered in your research in this area? I mean, I think it's a dense area, right? It's abstract. So it's hard for people um, to see its importance. And I think in the academy, we live in a bubble. And, this is a field that is very quote unquote public facing. We are a service field. We're a therapy, right? We're therapists. We're pathologists, but we're therapists. And so I think the big challenge sometimes is science kind of grows and grows over here, but it is completely inaccessible to the person who is going to be supporting the individuals who seek the services. Does that make sense there too? So for me, the biggest obstacle right now is one of accessibility, and the other obstacle that I'm going to be blunt and say it is my area of research is a critical area of research, and just like there's censorship in other areas, I'm being pushed out. Like I submitted for a conference, and it's not a conference that is historically been very how would we say intentional about rejecting, but it turns out that a majority of us who are doing these types of research studies are not being invited to present. So it's happening in that sense too.
Yeah, that's you're not alone, as you can imagine.
What a challenge, right?
Of the
Um,
unfortunate realities of the year 2025.
yeah. Yeah, and then Laura, thank you for sharing that experience. It is, and that's the thing, is like also sometimes it's built into governmental, organizations or structures that we have to learn one specific standardized way. But the reality is that what you mentioned there too is that if it means that with other people on the streets or wherever you were at socializing, you were noticing other ways of languaging being present, then that means that we really have autonomy over our bodies too, whether or not we want to comply always with what is the standardized version or not. And more importantly, do we want to judge our version to be less than, right? So like I learned English here when I came at the age of 17. And for many years, my mom used to have me read aloud so that I would, quote unquote, lose my accent. And I remember being a doc student and being very worried about whether or not I was being understood. Now I've been here 32 years. I still maintain my Español Dominicano to the degree that I can maintain it, although I haven't been back and I don't have a need, quote unquote, for it in my daily life. Right. And so but it's given me some compassion. So like where we are entering now in the part of the presentation is where we actually engage with the concept of languaging as being that space of that's a little bit more elastic, that's more pliable, that's more that allows us to exhale in terms of how we language. And I'm not saying that having access to standardized varieties, like it's very complicated to get into that space and say like, this is not good to just, to say that this is the good way. I've had students who came out of incarceration, for example, who are very pro teaching literacy in a specific way and getting, and sort of cocooning or putting aside their African-American English use. I'm speaking about a specific couple of students that I've engaged with recently. But so to tell a student, no, you're not supposed to be, demeaning that language. And then this student coming to me and said, yeah, but you're coming from a space of privilege because people are profiled and racialized based on how they speak. Their intellect is questioned based on how they speak. And so it's complex when we talk about it at multiple levels. I feel like I can engage with it at that level. And I also feel like very much that we need to also be in a space of imagination nowadays, when everything that we were told could not be undone is being undone in front of our eyes. Right? As far as institutions are concerned.
Well, I think that judging that goes on for the way that people speak, it goes at both ends of the spectrum. You might say at one level, it's people who are speaking a non-standard language form or something Ebonics or something that's not considered the best or perfect language by uh, uh, some people anyway. Uh, Also, there can be criticism of people who speak careful standard English,
We
as
have noticed
being
that.
as who's I mean, I personally experienced what I thought was a very weird comment on the way I speak. And it was that I intimidated people because I spoke in complete sentences. And this was from high officials in the US government that I had to work with. And I'm thinking, well, I mean, that's how I grew up speaking. I mean, I grew up
I
reading
mean,
and speaking.
anti-intellectualism is also an ideology, right? We know that.
Yes, right. I
So,
mean, it's pretty rampant, I would say, these days.
yeah,
So, I mean, these are, people's perspectives on language, especially spoken language, are something that get really rooted in I guess the cultural norms of the circles that people travel in.
right.
And yeah, so it is complicated. I want to ask a question that is probably it's just going to show my own ignorance, but could you give a good definition of languaging?
I will shortly, but yes,
I've
I'll
been
start
waiting
it.
for that.
I'll start it with, I think you had someone recently who talked about languaging too here in the museum. I saw a presentation on
Well,
YouTube that you had.
we have these people who we have this couple that do podcasts,
Uh-huh.
and it's languaging is the name of
Oh, it's the
their
name of the podcast. So
right. Yeah.
languaging, I became acquainted with the term through Professor Ofelia Garcia. I don't know if you know her work on translanguaging. So she, I would say, is the person who made that particular word, translanguaging, the stance, and also the pedagogical approach, mainstream in the United States, although we know that Suresh Kanagaraja and a number of other individuals in Europe were already doing work that centered those ways of communicating. So I'm not going to get into translanguaging so much yet. I'm going to take the languaging space. And so the notion of languaging, which was initially attributed to Humberto Maturana, who was a Chilean biologist, and who was really interested in the idea of embodied cognitions, right? Is that language carries in it the embodiment of our thoughts. Okay, so that's one layer of it. And then Swain, I forget the first name, but I can get you the reference, came up with the idea that language is also carried, that if we embody our thoughts in the words that we use, and that we use our bodies to be able to speak and or to move and or to point and or to make meaning with each other, then that means that language is embodied, and that making meaning is the purpose of it all, right? And that making meaning doesn't happen unless you are in relationship. And I pause there, ... because it doesn't have to be with another necessarily human being, right? When you sit down with when I have sat down with some individuals who are neurodivergent and identify as autistic, and they're non-speaking, and their ways of languaging may involve twirling or may involve touching the grass, maybe things that we don't conceptualize as language, we don't put meaning to as language because we don't live in the world or the mind of that human being, right? That's languaging too. So there's a little bit or a lot, I would say, that should be attributed to like indigenous epistemologies, because I do think that there's a lot that comes from those ways of being. But the notion of languaging is precisely that. You're taking what is usually positioned as outside of the body, a set of structures, something that you do with your mouth. And then anything that attaches to it, anything that is paralinguistic, that we may do as the sprinkles on the top of the ice cream, right? Anything that involves the idea of where that carries the story of your identity, where you come from, meaning your accentedness or your accent, the performance of your accent, that's also part of your languaging. And so because of that, then it lives inside of you. You have access to all these ways. And now you add technology to that. There's a recent paper that I think I just saw that came out yesterday that says the repertoires that we have access to change over time. And I love that, because sometimes I can even be static myself when I think about, well, I have access to my phone. I can send a text. I can send a text and send an emoji, and that's a way of languaging that I wouldn't necessarily have if although sometimes I wish I had an emoji in front of my face to actually show how I'm feeling, right? So there's that piece, drawing, art, movement, all of that becomes what languaging is. And so it really opens the door to what can be also portrayed in art as language. There's I'll show it in a moment, or I'll talk a little bit about it in a moment, but there's an artist having an exhibit now at the Whitney who is deaf, capital D deaf. And the entire exhibit is sort of a representation of life as a deaf communicator or languager. She uses sign, but also there's one section of the exhibit that I did not talk about in my presentation, but that I just was like blown away by it. She takes, and I've seen this done before, she takes like a vibrational machine and some nails and some paint on a canvas. And the vibration of the machine, she changes the tones and the loudness and those vibrations create a painting. Who's to say that that's not language too? So it really is like this notion of like expanding us to also incorporate our senses into what languaging is, which a lot of the times we reduce it to just speech. Did that help a little? Was that okay, Laura?
Yeah, that's very good. I mean, it's helpful. I can see that it's a somewhat comprehensive way of expressing communication.
Yes, you got it. So it also takes away this dichotomy between what is language and what is communication. It incorporates them both. And some people have trouble with that. And I can understand that. That's okay. But for me, it just expanded my ways of looking at people. And in a field where we are creating communication opportunities for individuals who may use communication, quote unquote, language very different from us in the sense that I'm not non-speaking. I use my eyes and my hands a lot. I can't tell you I've lost like control over the bottom half of my face since I came here to the US because I can use some of my other semiotics in expressing. But the fact of the matter is that I still speak, I still fit in within what would be expectations, right? But I think it's really powerful for people who are working with those individuals to have access to that.
Seems to me that simply stated, it's self-expression.
Yes, it is an expression, not just via speech, right? So like
Yeah, I mean,
expression in
your
the most
hands
fluid,
and
yes,
I think that's really
movement,
what it is in a
yeah,
nutshell.
yeah. And it incorporates everything that is silent too, right? Or
Which
everything that
can
we
be
would not.
self-expression.
Yes, I love it.
Okay.
And that's a self-expression that holds meaning once it is interpreted. It's kind of like a photograph to some extent, right? Like you take a picture, but then the picture is there. What you take from the picture may be different than what I take from the picture. Form of, I don't know. Maybe I'm looking at it simplistically from that perspective. But hopefully that helped a little. And we're actually going to get into the part of the presentation that covers that and the museum that was discussed. So I'm going to go ahead and present again. And so again, you know, the first half of this talk in terms of my classroom, our classroom engagements, we do a lot of questioning. What are the ideas? Resisting, reframing, what are some of the ideas? And then we are slowly also moving into what could be other imaginations of what language are. So again, this is work that has not necessarily been done in the field where we are still kind of labeling what is different versus disabled. So as I mentioned just now, embodiment, multimodality, relational meaning making, and the looking at these exchanges as dynamic, okay? And so again, it does sort of challenge also how we do science because it's really hard to measure any of these things, which is why I'm finding myself very drawn to other ways of doing work. And actually, I have to say the backsplash on this came from an embodied somatic therapy session that I had for myself with a scholar. And that's sort of what came out. And then this was the rendition of a student of mine who this is how she viewed her languaging evolving or her definitions evolving. I also have a poem, but I'll try to finish with that instead of taking time right now that I wrote a couple of days ago because I woke up at 3 a.m., but I'll do that. But just to show you that some of the ways in which this can be brought into higher education is by centering our students' authentic ways of using their language. And here you see that for there was a project that they had options of what to do in terms of identity and positionality. This was a number of years ago. This student chose to write a poem. This project was called Imagining Myself. And it talks about all of the threads of her culture, but also it shows her languaging in a way that centers parts of who she is that are often not valued in the classroom. Right, so I'll leave that there for a second so that you see a little bit. It's a beautiful poem. It's only a portion of it, what is here. Okay, are you ready for the next? And this was another poem, but also through the use of multimodality. So when I talk about, languaging is multimodal, how can that also be brought into the classroom space so that we're not just using text as the only medium, right? So I will play this one.
Saludos, my name is Shakira Perez, and I was inspired by Doctora Brea and all that I've learned from her to write a poem titled Unsee, Unmask, Undo. Affirming who we are should not be a revolutionary act, and yet here we are, at the crossroads of pervasive colonial frames, seeped into all facets of life, and decolonizing spaces that should have been for all in the first place. Luchando. The fight continues to unsee, unmask, undo. Unsee to truly see the possibilities of each, unmask to truly know the complexities within, undo to truly lead the coalition for all, for the parent who hopes so that iterations of su linaje can have a chance, for the child who dreams so that they see their possibilities sin límites, for the community who perseveres so that their voices become reflejos of their strength.
She's Dominican. She was one of my one of my first Dominican students at NYU. And what I love about this poem is not only that she's centering ideas that we had in the classroom that she understood very deeply and critically, but also she is translanguaging. So I had mentioned that word earlier. So the notion of the translanguaging stance is that all of our languaging is held within our repertoire, one repertoire, and that we can move across it, right? That it doesn't mean then that if we are crossing boundaries of tongues, that they have to be seen as two separate tongues in our heads. Because you see that she very beautifully weaves Spanish and English, her Dominican Spanish and English in this poem. So that's another example. So in addition to centering people's authentic languaging, being able to also exercise the muscle of imagination is really of essence. And this is where art has served as an incredible site of exploration. Using Robin D.G. Kelly's Freedom Dreaming, we had a project in which we developed collages that identify what are the common ideologies in early childhood settings and what are the ways in which you could imagine a early childhood educational setting that would be liberated in its languaging. And these three are actually just came out in this book. There's an additional one that I didn't put in here, but there's 4 collages from my students that just came out in a book, Beyond Compliance in Early Childhood. So there's a lot that we can do in the classroom, and we focus so much sometimes in grading and performance and competence, but if we don't have the room for imagination, what is the point of it, right? Again, I have spent the last 5 years telling my students, yes, I know we cannot undo the system because the system is there. So we're going to learn how to work within it, but also learn these other ways of doing things. Well, the system is being undone right in front of us. How do we exercise imagination to think of the worlds in which we want to co-create existence moving on? And then this is the most recent of all of the projects that we have done. It's the first time that I have done this. I'm kind of excited to see how it pans out. We're mapping our ideologies at the beginning of the semester using sort of a little bit of a structure from speech center to multimodal center to individual focused to community focused. And then using this to expand our languaging, we are visiting Christine Sun Kim's exhibit at the Whitney, and then choosing a couple of exhibits to really focus on, to then say, how can that expand your languaging and how can you move those little sticky notes around that map? And how can you then apply it to developing of a speech and language goal for intervention? How does it shift your old method into your new method? So this concept of embodied pedagogies or bringing embodiment more to also practice is being it's being explored this semester. I'll let you know how it goes. We're hoping like we can also publish on this. But just to say that this type of thinking, this type of engagement does impact our learners, which is what we're looking for. Now, I wouldn't say necessarily that I get always people who think this way. Again, it depends on where the individual is in their journeys, right? But it shows you that they are challenged and they take an ownership over being aware and awake and being participant in a more active way once they're out in their careers. Here's another example. It talks about actual deconstructive work, self-reflection and personal unlearning, and then the idea of culturally responsive pedagogies, which is what we are moving towards as a field. Okay, until we're not allowed to move towards it. And so all to say that I'll finish with the last few pieces because this then ushers in the notion of the museum. And actually, Melissa McSweeney, I think she's still in the call. If not, I can, but she's also part of the mastermind behind it. She was my student. The Bilingual Language and Literacy Investigative and Networking Group, it's a mouthful, is a collective that I started here at NYU, also had started it in Florida prior to that. We do a lot of this practicing of liberated languaging in different ways. We have a podcast where we host critical conversations. We also get out in the community to work with families on being sure that all of their languaging is represented. We work with an early childhood center in the Upper East Side here primarily. And out of that group is where Melissa, are you still here? I don't know if you're with kiddos.
Yes, I'm just feeling a 4-year-old, but I'm also
Okay. All right. So out of this group is where Melissa had the original inspiration for the museum. Do you want to just tell them briefly what how you got inspired for the museum? I'm putting her on the spot.
Sure.
These are not chips.
Okay, Zaki.
Not chips.
I'm sorry. We have a little Zaki, can you say hi?
It's okay. I can tell them to. If not, at least they see you.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi.
Yes. I think the inspiration was really sweetheart, through my involvement with Bling and going, just meeting like the different speakers who came in and reading Dr. Brea's work and interacting with just like that critical thinking about like languaging and how it really goes beyond not only what a certain culture would like, they might idealize certain languages, there's certain types of languaging, but just like over the whole like prioritization of language is something that is like spoken or written as the only modalities. It was just like really going beyond that and really critically thinking about how we use language and how that could be represented in art and how we want to hear other people. I'm so sorry. Hear others.
Good. We're languaging with him too.
Exactly. Yes, lots of language, sweetheart. Sorry, but
no, that was great.
There was a lot more inspiration there, but maybe Dr. Brea can talk about the rest.
Yeah, but I wanted to elevate Melissa because Melissa was the one that originally came up with the idea. She was the seed for what then became what you see here. So we've had it 2 years in a row. And actually Melissa's the one that did these mock-ups of what the space could look like eventually. And here's a little video of how the space actually ended up looking. And she did all this remote because at the time she was in Canada. So.
I'm Russell. Nice to meet you. Do you know where the mark is? Anthony. I'm off.
So we had a lot of paintings or drawings and poetry last year. So it's important to say that the 2 years have been slightly different. That's my photography here. And then we also had some pieces that were sent digitally and some people who joined us on Zoom and performed their pieces from different places, including Europe at the time. So you get the idea, right? It's one big room at NYU, and it had a lot of these. So that was last year's. We had 40 submissions overall, some of which also came from people who were communicatively disabled, who then also provided another layer, right? To like when we talk about having museums on language as a verb, a lot of the times a lot of the pieces were on people who were bilingual, people who were reconnecting. There was a beautiful piece on a kitchen and sort of the language of in the kitchen, languaging in the kitchen, and the shared stories, the storytelling that can happen through cooking together. Sometimes that is not even spoken. So that was very much, that was last year. And we did publish a little piece on it, as you see there. And then this year, we took it next level. So last year we had 40 entries. This year we had 30, but almost every entry was either a performance or had an audience engagement or interactive piece to it. And the one here on the left is actually a piece that Melissa built herself that actually engaged attendees with the notion of ideologies, and specifically the ideologies in the Bowler and my paper. We had a reading nook. We had readers who came and read their books bilingually. We had a person who did origami, who taught people how to do origami as another embodied practice through art. We had a couple of an autistic person who sent an incredible exhibit about what it's like to STEM with specific objects, and the notion of texture as part of like also perceiving and languaging. And so all of this to say that we definitely grew. I don't know that we're going to do this next year because we are like you all with the funding and the human power sort of constrained at this point, but this is so the notion of liberating languaging and to engage it in terms of the community is to bring it outside of the classroom and not to think of it so much as a space that is constantly about fighting the structure, but more about how can we be together and the audience piece, the audience participation piece actually got at that, in that people felt like they were in their joy. And so to what extent can we build spaces that allow us to art make and also question these ideas and also imagine different places, different worlds in terms of language, that also allows us to be in the space. And that's, to me, that's at the crux of what we would say, becoming the change that we want to be in the world right now. So our existence is always going to be impacted by systems. We are always going to be the global and the local. And as Cornel West said, we must become the voice, not just the echo, because solidarity is what it means is to bring this speech. And in this mode, we're going monomoto to action, though, to embodiment, right? And so the notion is to become and cultivate that critical liberatory consciousness. That's what this work is about. And so I'll finish with plopping the names on there that are my people. The top people are the blingers who were behind the museum, the people that are my co-thinkers, freedom co-learners, and then the bottom are my colleagues, without whom I wouldn't have my own safe spaces, right? And there's my name there. And then just in case you want to have a list of recommended resources, which also has my blog. It also has that poem that I was going to read for you, so I don't have to read it because I know we're running short on time. So you can feel free. It has a little bit more. It's very new. I have some pieces on Medium too, but it has, I'm trying to write more creatively and also more accessibly. So I'm challenging myself to write in different ways. So I'm going to stop share, but you can point your phone at that. And also I did send the PDF version of the handout to Emily. All right, 5 minutes.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Maria Rosa. That was a really fascinating presentation. I think you did also manage to address all the other questions and comments throughout the program. So we don't have any left here. But again, truly appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today. And again, thank you to you and to everybody